All right, we are up.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sergey, and I will be talking about documentation. This is a presentation by Jazz, Danish, and myself, and we want to explore the directions in which we can take Waku documentation from 1 to 10. So we have already reached from 0 to 1 stage. How can we make it even better? So the presentation consists of uh, two parts. This is part one, where we use the framework for else and discuss what the problem statement is, what the state of the art is, and what we actually want to achieve with our documentation. And then we have a concrete proposal for the documentation structure that is arguably better than we have now. And yeah, then we'll discuss relevant topics after that. So what do we have right now? We have the webpage docs.waku.org, and there are a few issues that we have identified with that page. So first of all, the layout is not very clear. So we have the left pane and we have the top pane, and their relationship is not always obvious. Specifications are also not that easy to find. It's not obvious why we have the VAC specs, but also the Waku specs. It's not clear how the versioning should work for the specs. The names might sometimes be confusing, and we should clarify this for users of our documentation. Also, we argue that we maybe should improve the style of the docs and make it more to the point. So we assume that if a developer is reading the documentation, they already have bought into the decentralization narrative and they know why this is good and why this is interesting. We don't need to bombard them with more marketing language here. We also should be more concrete in the happy path. So our documentation currently provides lots of different options, such as how you can run a Waku node in a Docker Compose or a Docker container or build from source. We should be opinionated and provide one option that we think is most appropriate for most users, and then link to more advanced resources where other options are listed. And also, it's important to keep documentation not just up to date, but also make it clear how long ago a certain page has been updated, whether it's up to date or maybe not. What is good about our approach so far? So first of all, we have the separate domain, docs.waku.org, with the resources concentrated there. The spec-driven culture is also what we can mention as our advantage. We have the full REST API reference for Waku, which is apparently not auto-generated, but it is published. It is comprehensive. We have a video tutorial on how to build a game with Waku, and we have a global search panel that also works reasonably well. We also have conducted research on other comparable projects in order to figure out what they are doing and how their documentation is structured. And hopefully we learn something from them. So, sorry. So what are the principles that we have learned? We should provide examples first and theory later. So this is what we observed, for example, in Solana and IPFS. This approach engages developers the fastest. So first show an example of, for example, sending a message or sending some amount of tokens, if we're talking about a cryptocurrency system, or if we're talking about file sharing system, this is how you upload a file, this is how you download a file. And then explain the necessary concept in more detail. We also observed this pattern of persona-based navigation. For example, in these decentralized systems, and Waku is also among them, a user might want to participate in different roles. For example, they may be a developer or a node operator or a potential contributor to the Waku protocol stack itself. So we should, again, show the way, depending on the persona, direct them to the resources that they need. We also notice that projects have cookbooks or task-oriented docs that show concretely how to do certain small tasks. IPFS has one-to-one mapping between command line interface of their implementation and the REST API, which makes sense. Architecture diagrams, inline glossary links. So yeah, a few projects that we've studied have glossaries with definitions of the key terminology. And not only do these projects have glossaries, we also have glossary in the Waku documentation, but the terms are being referenced to from other parts of the docs, and it is quite convenient if you don't know what a particular term means, you have a clear way to learn that. Live playgrounds, another thing that we observed, is very good in the sense that it removes the friction for developers to try out things. So instead of having to download the code, run Docker, or compile something or run something, you can just press a button and run something in your browser and see the results immediately. Even if it's perhaps not the most decentralized way, right? It perhaps uses some centralized service node or something like that. That perhaps it's not is not the point here. The point is to show, okay, this is how you use it. Certain proposals that we have, or certain things, again, that we observed, and we suggest everyone to think about how we should integrate these ideas, whether we should integrate these ideas into the Waku documentation. So these colored circles represent approximately how much effort it requires. And again, this is up to discussion, it's like very preliminary estimation. So role-based navigation, as already mentioned, we should separate developers, node operators, and so on. Sometimes we also observe the pattern which resembles Rust book or Proto School, or I should add Speedrun Ethereum. These are all chapterized learning projects that present a sequence of exercises of increasing complexity that that teach the developer to do certain clear landing page. Implementation metrics, yeah, this is another interesting one. So in the libp2p documentation, and libp2p is very relevant for Waku, obviously. In this screenshot, you can see that there are multiple implementations of libp2p, and there are multiple features or transports in this case that are either implemented or in progress or prototype or not implemented, and you can see which implementation actually has which functionality. Developer experience, learning content, again, partially intersecting with what I have already presented. We should present an opinionated happy path, tutorials, cookbooks, guided challenges. It's also important to list prerequisites early and clearly. And if a certain version of an operating system is required, or a certain version of compiler or Docker or any other infrastructure component is required, we should state this clearly and perhaps provide a one-liner terminal instruction that people can copy-paste and run to install the necessary dependencies. Security warnings also, we've discovered that quite understandably, documentation contains security warnings, for example, about exposing your RPC to the outside world and other potentially dangerous actions that we want to warn users about. Of course, AI is all the rage nowadays, and in particular, for our use case, we have observed that certain projects, I think Solana is the most prominent here, in using AI inside their documentation. So they have multiple things that facilitate that. So they have llm.txt, they have a hosted MCP server, and we might think about that. Perhaps that requires a bit more effort, although llms.txt, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert on that, but that just basically means providing all your documentation in one markdown file for AI agents to digest. This might be useful. Although I might say also that based on the research that we've done, these AI agents not always work as intended, and sometimes the answers are, well, very well written, but not actually useful. So maybe we should be careful here. Playgrounds, progress, and feedback, last updated. This, I think, somewhat covers already what I have described a bit earlier. So I'm going to skip to the next part. So preliminary conclusion is that we should think about maintenance of the docs and not just making them better or improving them here and now in this moment, but also thinking about how we can create a structure around that and a process around that such that documentation is made up to date and well maintained. Now I'm going to switch to the second part of the presentation, which covers concrete proposal on the documentation structure. So this is what the docs web page could look like, or its main chapter that it consists of. And I will briefly go through these parts and explain what they contain. Again, this is a rough draft, and there will be perhaps a forum post with a more elaborate description of what we propose and gather feedback. So the getting started or the landing page should basically be very brief. It should briefly describe what Waku is, why it is interesting and useful, and then direct the reader accordingly to their persona. Depending on what the reader would like to do, we then guide them to the integration guide or to architecture description or to instruction how to run a node or how to contribute. On integrating Waku, this section is supposed to be targeted at developers. So if an application developer wants to use Waku in their project, this page should be the entry point and explain, again, why Waku is useful for that concrete use case, what is needed, explain that you probably need an SDK, what is an SDK, what options do I have as a developer, whether I should run a node or whether I must run a node or not, again, direct to the corresponding page, and then provide some minimal example. Here is a screenshot from the Solana cookbook, Solana documentation, where they have snippets of common actions that developers might want to take, such as send some cryptocurrency. This is how you do it. In Rust, this is how you do it in TypeScript, and so on. The next section is Waku architecture. This could be a more theoretical section that provides the background and explains the core concepts of Waku. And what we think is important is to try to separate fundamental notions from implementation details. And one subchapter, perhaps, of this section could be explanation of Waku in general, what moving parts it consists of, what is a protocol, what is a node, what does it mean for a node to implement a protocol. And it's important to use diagrams here heavily. And I found in the documentation that I have looked at personally, I found that diagrams are very important when a certain piece of software contains of many moving parts that interact with each other. And diagrams are helpful to make it clear what depends on what and which parts are interchangeable and which parts depends on one another. Implementations wise, in this subsection, we should explain the relationship between different parts of the stack. What are the protocols? Again, more concretely, which implementations do we have? Which SDKs or bindings do we have? How they depend on one another? And what a developer actually would use when implementing Waku-related functionality in their app. Section on running a node. Here we explain why someone would want to run a Waku node and explain how to do that. So arguably, the main option or the primary option that should be presented here is using an Waku Compose, which is based on Docker Compose and runs a node with some additional software that helps the node operation. As an optional feature here, we could implement an interactive choose your setup guide. And this is a screenshot from bitcoin.org, where they have a section choose your wallet, where they ask 4 questions along the lines of, what's your operating system? Then they ask, what's your level of familiarity with Bitcoin, something of that nature. And based on these questions, they provide a recommendation. Okay, this is what we recommend for your as your wallet. So here we could recommend, this is your recommended implementation. This is your recommended way of using it. Now, the contribution page is targeted to potential new contributors that want to submit pull requests or issues to the Waku stack itself. Here, the goal could be give some kind of general guidance of how external contributors are welcome and how contributions are processed, and then redirect to the contributing guide of the respective repository or the respective software artifact that a contributor is interested in. So we could mention here potential contributions to the node implementations, perhaps to the specs as well, and mention that we have good first issues on GitHub and that people can ask questions on Discord and provide some guidelines and best practices. The specs page, maybe it should just be a redirect, but if it's not, it should give an overview of spec, why we write specs, why we have this spec-centered culture, and then redirect to the main spec repo, which we also have. FAQ section answers common questions. So from what I understand, we have a certain set of questions that come up quite frequently when discussing Waku with people, when presenting Waku, when talking to people at conferences and whatnot. Some aspects of our stack or architecture confuse people, so we should be straight here and clear and give clear answers to commonly asked questions, such as how does Waku compare to libp2p, for example, or how does Waku relate to status. Glossary, as mentioned earlier, should be some kind of a dictionary, or a glossary of terms. And an example here can be the Ethereum website, ethereum.org/n/glossary, where they have, well, I haven't counted, but I assume many dozens of terms defined and interconnected. And I find this very helpful. Last but not least, we have the REST API reference page, and it should be integrated into the general documentation structure, either, again, as an external link or maybe a page with a bit of background and context and link to the existing page on this URL that provides the REST API reference. So this is the general overview of what we've come up with on the topic of improving the documentation. And some questions for discussion that I suggest we can think about and talk about are as follows. So priorities, clearly some things that I've mentioned here are kind of minor changes, whereas other things require restructuring of the whole documentation. And I must also mention that many parts of the documentation that I have mentioned, we already have in some form. So we already do have a glossary. We already do have the FAQ section. The issue is that it's not trivial to find, and it's not, in my opinion at least, not logically connected to other parts of the docs. So how do we define an MVP improvement of the documentation such that with minimal effort we can achieve great results and not just do a one-time improvement, but make it part of the process? So this leads us to the second question that we can think of. Who should be responsible? How should we integrate the documentation maintenance into our regular development guidelines? How do we make sure that docs are up to date? And who should keep track of that? Yeah, so with that, I think I can wrap up the presentation and invite you for the discussion.
Hello, Sergey. Thank you for the presentation. I have maybe like 1.5 questions. Well, really one question. In terms of continuous updates to the docs, and you mentioned generated API docs, but is there a structure that the group discuss or can propose towards continuous updates for the docs on a daily, weekly, monthly, and beyond basis?
So no 100% clear answers. This is up to discussion. I like somewhat random thought, I think, and again, open to feedback, is that some things, and we've discussed this somewhat in the previous discussion earlier today, that it might be possible to generate certain parts of the documentation directly from the code or from the comments inside the code, but that obviously cannot cover everything. So basically things that are very close to the code could at least theoretically be updated automatically on each build or each release. But on top of that, we should definitely have more generic high-level descriptions, examples, and so on, which should be maintained manually. But on the other hand, these things don't change as frequently either. Like the architecture of Waku won't change week by week. So different cadences there are appropriate, I think.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hello. Maybe something to add. Yeah, currently, to answer the question, the REST API documentation is not auto-generated. We are maintaining the Open API spec in a separate repository from where we are generating a consumable web page where you are able to examine the API. Something similar might be useful for the hopefully upcoming Waku SDK and application SDK. I do buy in the idea of code snippets to engage developers, how highlighting how easy is to embed Waku in your project. And I think what we can define as an MVP, from my opinion, is kind of Waku should have a landing page where we clarify very simple terminologies to kind of subtract from the glossary that what is Waku, what is a Waku network, what is Waku as a software, and to be able to direct the reader in their interest and to go deeper in the knowledge gathering. Of course, a clear glossary is even very useful for the team, I think, because we are using terminology interchangeable, which is not always straightforward, even in our daily discussions. So I think it's our own interest as well. And I would, from generic term, I would leave out very detailed API or SDK specification for this, rather restrict the main page for architectural diagrams and the code snippets, and not to retain somebody with complexities. So that was what I would like to add.
Yeah, thank you for that. I second your point on terminology and how it can be useful. Again, like for me personally, sometimes it's difficult to wrap my head around the terms that we use, and sometimes it turns out that the same thing is called different names, or yeah, just sometimes it might be confusing, and glossary can help alleviate that.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for the presentation. Something I was thinking about is I remember during Jazz's presentation, he showed this like layered chart that goes from like vision to dependencies with different scales of scope and actionability at each layer. I wonder if you've thought of something similar, not organized perhaps by scope and action, but more by like one, I guess, is frequency of change, and two, I guess scope of audience. So for example, from my personal experience working on Waku, there were very few times where I was actually reading the documentation. I did read the specs a lot, and I would refer to the specs a lot. But and then to some extent, when I was doing Nwaku stuff, their REST API. But as like an internal developer, I didn't really catch myself using the documentation too often. Are we intending for the docs to be mostly an external facing thing? As in, is it more focused for external developers, hackathon participants, partners, than it is for people who are actually like developing the protocol? And I guess my other just like more general idea is or question is have you thought about like the logical order from specs all the way to like the most outward facing document, and are there like some insights we could potentially get from kind of ordering all of our docs related what would you call them, systems or websites or repos or whatever, in that kind of an order?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in my view, I think the primary audience are either external developers or like external participants of the community, or perhaps new contributors that need to be onboarded and need to understand what we are building. So yeah, something to think about. I mean, maybe kind of a follow-up question from me would be that, I mean, I'm trying to put together in my head, is there even this spectre, or is there a straight line that goes from the specs to most high-level description? Is it like a one-dimensional space, or maybe it has two or more dimensions, because we have like an implementation hierarchy, and we also have like an abstraction hierarchy. But I'm just thinking out loud. Okay, let me pass the mic to Jess or someone.
Yeah, I might jump in real quick. I'm not sure I see the division line between internal contributors and external contributors and users. I think there's a question of there's different knowledge levels, right? As someone who's recently joined as a contributor, getting up to speed on everything's been quite challenging in terms of like where to find it. The default answer right now is that you go and you have to ask in a Discord and hope that someone can give you an answer. And I think that there's lots of room to improve on that part, just on different knowledge levels, right? I think most people in this call have a high level of knowledge, and so they need docs less because they know where to go. I think that routing part would be really helpful for new people, right? Finding out what spec I need to read has actually been, fairly challenging, rather than just, a linear search through them all. So I think having some framing around that helps like kind of route people to where all the different places for knowledge are. It would be like a first easy step. I think getting all that knowledge in one spot would be, phase 2 of some degree. But that, I think that it's more around different knowledge levels in China, kind of retain people who come into the project. I think I'm kind of riffing off of the building the FOSS presentation from the other day about, some retention is also important about when people come in and are interested, how do we make sure that they can kind of, self-service and find the data that they need rather than, dividing it based upon, where people come from. Does that make any sense, Arseni?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I guess I'd be curious to hear more from you specifically because, I mean, you joined fairly recently and you had to, get up to speed with a lot of the protocol and its implementation fairly fast. And use that to develop a lot of your own documentation and charts and all that. And I guess I'm curious, like, how was your experience doing that? Which documents did you focus on the most and find most valuable? And, from an internal perspective, what do you think like could have been improved?
Yeah. So I think what could be improved part, we listed a lot of them in the presentation. I think it's that routing part. I've gone to the docs so many times to be like, okay, I'm searching for some answers. Where do I go? And I felt that part, there was interaction failure where I couldn't find where I needed to go. My example that I'd put for everyone if they want to run through this paces is without going directly to it, start at Google or Discord, go try to find the specification for SDS. That took me a very, very long time. And still I have to go back. I have a bookmark now so I can get back there. But it's hard to get, where you want to be. It's hard to necessarily get there, right? We have information stored in docs, like 3 different spec repositories, websites that sometimes link to things and are being moved. I think the sheer amount of locales that we store data in becomes problematic. Having more of a central repository would be fantastic, but if not that, just having a place that kind of unifies them all, at least for like a routing perspective of one spot I can go to that says, hey, this is the best information that we have on this subject. One of the other things I've also struggled with is trying to help out people in the Discord who come in with questions, because I think that's very important when we have someone who's very excited to build. How do we kind of maintain that energy? And I'm having a hard time pointing them at the information that they need. That's a very valid question. And so I think as a benchmark about how do we succeed, making sure that we have something to give people who have good questions, and being able to point them in the right direction such that they can go and build what they want, I think would be a pretty good KPI for success on how docs are working. So to recap on what's been particularly difficult, routing, figuring out where to go, making sense of all the different places that information lives. General like search, most websites, if I go to, I can kind of do whether it's a search term or even get into LLMs, I can go and find that piece of data about where I should be looking more. I think that's been the most struggling part is the, whether you want to call it search engine optimization or even just like indexing across the different topics in a way that's easy for people to go and find. Right now, you need to have a whole lot of knowledge about filter and all these different protocols to meaningfully use Waku. And it's hard to figure out how those concepts work together, which led to the talk about having a high level about how things work so I can kind of figure out into the knowledge tree about where I want to dig some more. I think those have been the 2 major items. Large overview, where to go to find more information, particularly for what I'm looking for.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like there's a lot of short-term gains we can get just by identifying what we can remove and unpublish, so to speak. Because I think like the problem you described in regards to just like, okay, if you go on Google or whatever and you try to search for, how to do something with Waku, it's possible that there's going to be like outdated or just like not maintained results that may just like add more friction than value. So maybe something we can do to like start this effort is just identify like, okay, these things that we have here, we can just remove. We can just unpublish them. We can archive them, and then kind of like build up from there.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few cases. I have to check my notes on where there's conflicting information, which is, that's never helpful because then you get a little bit lost. Particularly the Waku specs and then the VAC specs. I don't believe that there's a link between the two. So you are looking in one spot, you're like, these are all the specs, and you're like, actually, some are here and some are there. That comes back to that like high level overview about where things live would be really helpful. So yeah, I think you combine removing the friction points through duplicate information that's maybe out of date. Combine that with, I think just like a high level, this is what Waku is and this is how everything works, so people can get a high level concept. I find that those pieces are a little bit fragmented and then hard to kind of get the big picture. But that's just my experience, right? I'm sure lots of other people out there have been having their own. It might make sense to see if we can wrangle a couple and see how they're feeling about the onboarding into the Waku space.
Yeah, and maybe we can even make a note to make it part of our onboarding process for especially for CCs, is just have them go through the docs and with this fresh but committed perspective, and identify use this as like an iterative opportunity to identify improvements.
Most definitely. I think a lot of those have been captured in this presentation as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I come from a little bit of a Rust background, and so I'd like to see a Rust book to some degree, not to the same depth, but these are the large concepts of Waku. This is what you wanted to know if you're going to dive deep into it. That kind of, that structure I find is very helpful for just as I'm diving in and trying to contribute to the project. I need to have a little bit more than just this is how you run a node, although that is helpful. There's these larger concepts that we have around, the protocols at play, filter. How does that play in? How do we feel about it? And just having a little bit more of a paragraph write up on how these items fit in and maybe where to go find more information would be a key one, right? And with that framework, then we can build out as people ask more questions. And we notice that the Discord's full of people asking the difference between a pub sub topic and a content topic. And you're like, oh, great, we can add some specification there, or some specificity, sorry.
Yeah, and I think this is crossing over a little bit into the developer community, but I think Sergey, you had suggested either creating a Stack Overflow or just like adding Stack Overflow questions related to Waku, and perhaps as we see like the same question asked in Discord, or even if we internally come up with a good question that isn't like immediately answerable by the docs, then perhaps like every time we do that, we should just make a have one of us make a Stack Overflow question and then have someone else answer it.
Yeah, maybe I could add a short comment on Stack Overflow. So my idea, it's kind of a very early idea in my head, based on my experience in Bitcoin and Ethereum communities. Both Bitcoin and Ethereum and a few other cryptocurrency projects do have their own Stack Exchange Q&A sites, of which Stack Overflow is the flagship of the Stack Exchange network. So you can do your custom network. If you can start a site, and if it gathers enough attention, upvotes, questions, and so on, it is promoted to its own domain and becomes officially part of the network. And what I find helpful in that types of websites is that they are very practice-oriented, and they have this clear structure of, okay, this is an issue that someone faces, this is the question, people provide answers, then upvote answers, and then the person who asked the question can mark a particular answer as the answer that resolved the initial issue, like the accepted answer. Yeah, so what I find helpful is that there is a certain gap between documentation, even if well written, even if we cover all the, I don't know, API function calls and all the architecture and so on, still we cannot cover all the potential use cases or edge cases that people will face. And yeah, having this repository of questions and answers has been really helpful for me in other communities. Of course, I'm also worth noting here that the majority of questions, or like very often questions, maybe of like lower quality. People ask, how can, like, I lost my wallet, how do I recover the keys, or my exchange has scammed me, or something like that. But after some filtering or after some moderation, what remains is an ever-growing archive of high-quality questions that can be revisited by newcomers.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like it would be extremely useful.
Yeah, I love it. The one thing I would say that we should be mindful of is adding yet another place that information lives without somehow codifying all the different knowledge spaces. So that coupled with some way that we can say this is where we answer questions or put it into a framework, I think that'd be fantastic.
Totally agree. Also, like a note that, I mean, maybe worth pointing out, what I've been thinking about is that as long as we have multiple informational resources, like first of all, I definitely support the idea of removing stuff that we don't need or that is outdated and duplicate. But even after we remove this stuff, most likely we will end up with more than one resource. So we will have docs.waku.org, and we will have certain amount of documentation like information in the repos on GitHub, like README files will remain either way. So maybe we should come up with some more or less clear guidelines or principles about what goes where. So maybe define some level of abstraction or some criteria that, okay, this type of information lives in the README, this type of information lives in the docs, this lives in the specs, and this goes to a Q&A resource of some kind.
Yeah. I'll take an action item next week to see if I can document all of the places where data lives. I think the first step is figure out what the knowledge space actually looks like. And then we can, hopefully highlight some areas that there's duplication or uncertainty. I think if we had a nice map of what, where things live, it might become a lot clearer about what optimizations we can make. So I'll take an action for that.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.